A car sat unmoved on a quiet street for 11 days. No tickets, no driver, just there. By the time someone called it in, the FBI had launched a full-scale manhunt, and what they found inside wasn't a bomb, but something far worse. It started with a parked car on a quiet residential street in Bethesda, Maryland, the kind of place where people notice when something seems off. For over a week, the car didn't move. No one got in or out. It wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't causing trouble, but something about it just didn't feel right. One neighbor eventually made a phone call, just to be safe. That call triggered a chain reaction that would pull in the FBI's counterintelligence division, launch one of the quietest surveillance operations of the Cold War, and uncover a hidden spy game playing out in the suburbs. The strange part? The man being spied on had no idea he was part of it. This is the true story of how a motionless car, doing absolutely nothing, nearly unraveled a top-secret Soviet intelligence operation. Officer Darren Wilkes had been with the Montgomery County Police Department for over 11 years, and in that time, he'd responded to everything from burglary calls to domestic disturbances. But when the dispatch crackled through with a report about a suspiciously parked car on Elmridge Lane, he assumed it would be routine, a college kid's forgotten junker, a neighbor dispute, maybe an expired tag at worst. What he didn't expect was to be staring through the tinted windows of a late-model silver Dodge Diplomat that looked pristine on the outside, but hadn't moved an inch in 11 days, according to the HOA president who flagged it. And as he crouched beside the driver's door, jotting down the South Dakota plate 4LZ337, he already had a hunch something was off. The car's exterior was too clean for one that had supposedly been abandoned. No dust film, no bird droppings, tires inflated, even the chrome trim glinting in the late afternoon sun as if it had just rolled off a dealer lot. And when dispatch called back 10 minutes later confirming that the plate was linked to a stolen vehicle report filed out of Rapid City nearly 6 months prior, Darren's brow furrowed, because what the hell was a stolen South Dakota car doing parked for nearly 2 weeks in a quiet Maryland suburb near government offices and defense contractors? Reaching for his maglite, he leaned closer to the driver's window, cupping the side of his face to cut the glare, and what he saw made his stomach clench. A spotless cabin, bench seats that looked barely used, but more importantly, a tiny circular hole drilled into the upper dash, perfectly symmetrical. No signs of cracking or amateur tooling, just precision, like something machined by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And then he saw the wiring, barely visible behind the vent slats. Thin colored strands bundled and zip-tied. Not factory-spec wiring, but something aftermarket, hidden, carefully routed, as if designed to avoid detection. Pulling back, Darren stepped away from the car and radioed for backup, voice tight, his gut screaming that this wasn't just a stolen car dumped by joyriders. This was clean, surgical, almost deliberate in its placement. When Sergeant Lopez arrived minutes later and reviewed the situation, she made a quiet call to her own contact at the Baltimore field office of the FBI, choosing not to go through standard channels, and when she used the phrase possible signal intercept hardware, everything changed. The order was given not to touch the car again, not to pop the hood, not even to tap the glass, and within the hour, a black SUV with government plates rolled up at the corner of Elmridge and Pine Haven, and 2 men in plain suits stepped out, not flashing badges but radiating the kind of authority that made even senior officers step back. Whatever this was, it was no longer a matter for local police. And as Darren watched one of the agents kneel beside the Dodge with a slim electronic device and sweep it slowly along the window sill, he realized the car wasn't just suspicious. It was active. By 6:42 p.m., Officer Darren Wilkes stood beside Sergeant Lopez under the growing shadow of the parked Dodge Diplomat, both of them speaking in low tones as dusk gathered and porch lights blinked on up and down Elmridge Lane. They weren't supposed to jump the chain of command, but Lopez had seen enough in her 15 years to know when a situation needed discretion over bureaucracy, and so instead of routing the discovery through the standard incident reporting system, she placed a direct quiet call to the regional FBI field office in Baltimore, her contact being a man named Nathaniel Avery, a reserved, methodical agent she'd met during a joint task force years ago, who had once told her, "If you ever see something that looks too clean to be real, call me first." Avery didn't ask many questions. He just asked for the license plate, a quick rundown of the scene, and whether any civilian had come into contact with the car. And when she told him it had been parked for nearly 2 weeks across from a Department of Energy analyst's house, with no fingerprints, a precision-drilled dashboard, and possibly concealed wiring, his pause lasted long enough to tell her everything she needed to know. Do not touch the vehicle. Do not approach again. Keep a 2-house perimeter, and we'll be there within the hour, he said. And before Lopez could ask what division he was with these days, the line went dead, standard protocol when something was being escalated. What neither she nor Officer Wilkes realized at that moment was that their cautious decision had just set in motion a deeply classified alert system within the FBI's Cold War counterintelligence apparatus, one reserved for signs of active surveillance, possible Soviet drop cars, or listening posts disguised as civilian vehicles. And within minutes of Lopez's call, Avery was inside a secure basement office beneath the Baltimore Field headquarters, briefing 2 agents from Section D5, a little-known unit responsible for investigating espionage threats near Washington, Langley, and other high-priority federal zones. Bethesda, with its dense population of federal employees, contractors, and cleared scientists, was on their Tier 1 watch list. And the idea that a car had been sitting within 100 feet of a Department of Energy analyst's home, unmoved and possibly bugged, was enough to kick over a hornet's nest. By 8:10 p.m., a mobile unit was already en route with a signal analysis technician, a counter-surveillance specialist, and orders to determine whether the car was transmitting, recording, or being used for scheduled intercepts. No uniforms, no marked vehicles, just plain black SUVs, plain black gear bags, and plain black coffee as they rolled south into the suburbs under cover of twilight. The kind of operation that wouldn't make the news, wouldn't appear on any report visible to local law enforcement, but one that would set off internal alarms from Langley to the Pentagon. Within 48 hours, if what they suspected turned out to be true, that someone had parked an eye and ear directly in front of a federal target, and waited. Under cover of darkness, a mobile command van parked 2 blocks from the suspicious Dodge Diplomat, while a smaller unmarked SUV coasted silently into position near the vehicle, its headlights off, its occupants moving with practiced restraint. 2 agents emerged, one of them carrying what looked like a toolkit, but was actually a compact EM spectrum analyzer capable of detecting passive and active surveillance frequencies, while the other deployed a device that swept for radio emissions in the civilian and military bands. They moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to cause interference or, worse, alert whoever might be monitoring the feed if the car was indeed hot. What they found within 10 minutes made both agents stiffen visibly. The car wasn't just wired, it was alive. A narrow-beam microwave antenna had been installed behind the speaker grille of the passenger-side dash, perfectly aligned, not with the street or nearby intersections, but with the second-floor windows of a single home directly across from the vehicle. Its signal aimed at a tight, specific corridor no wider than a picture frame. It was surgical, tight band, directional surveillance, far more advanced than what would be found in a domestic criminal case, and sophisticated enough that it likely wasn't just recording sound, but also transmitting it in bursts to a mobile receiver, possibly driven past the neighborhood every few days to collect the data. By 10:15 p.m., the FBI's Signal Exploitation Unit had confirmed the presence of a low-profile acoustic sensor array embedded in the cabin trim, likely utilizing vibration-based microphones that could pick up voices from over 100 feet away, provided the angle and structural resonance was right. This wasn't hobbyist gear, it was professional, Cold War-era espionage tech with modern refinements, and that raised a larger, more urgent question. Who was the target? Within the hour, a separate team began combing through the public and classified employment records of the street's residents, and it didn't take long to find the anomaly. Thomas H. Brenner, 41, employed since 1976 at the Department of Energy's Nuclear Materials Division, a mid-level analyst whose clearance granted him routine but meaningful access to sensitive reports involving the storage and transfer of enriched uranium, reprocessing data, and occasionally briefings linked to nuclear non-proliferation treaty assessments. He wasn't top brass, not someone who would make the cover of Foreign Affairs, but he was exactly the kind of overlooked asset a foreign agency might try to exploit, especially if they believed he had access to files not logged in the formal chain. By midnight, FBI counterintelligence had added Brenner's name to a priority monitoring list and quietly tapped into his landline, hoping to determine whether he was complicit or merely under observation, while two agents in plain clothes were assigned to begin background surveillance at his workplace the next morning. Whatever this was, it was more than a rogue wiretap. Someone had parked a digital ear in front of a federal employee's home and had been listening, perhaps for weeks, waiting for something worth collecting, and they'd almost gotten away with it. Thomas Brenner had always kept a low profile, the kind of man whose name rarely came up in any internal audit or classified clearance review. A model federal employee whose file read like a spreadsheet of predictable reliability, civil service since 1976, bachelor's in physics from Carnegie Mellon, clearance level Q with supplemental access to restricted reactor logistics, no disciplinary flags, no financial red flags, no erratic travel. And yet, by 8:30 the next morning, his name was sitting at the top of a newly created FBI surveillance dossier marked Priority Observe, Tier 1. Because in a neighborhood full of quiet federal employees, Brenner lived directly across the street from an active foreign surveillance array, hidden inside a stolen vehicle, and that meant, by logic, by tradecraft, or by sheer terrifying coincidence, he was either a target or a participant. The counterintelligence team didn't wait for speculation, and by noon that day, a two-man surveillance crew had been embedded outside his office building, posing as Department of Commerce auditors, while a separate technical team began monitoring his calls, checking for encrypted phrases, unusual phrasing, code words, anything that might indicate contact with a handler. One agent was dispatched to quietly interview Brenner's co-workers at the Department of Energy, asking vague questions under the guise of an interagency review on contractor oversight. Was Brenner punctual? Ever speak about dissatisfaction with policy? Did he seem stressed, distracted, or unusually curious about things outside his department? The answers came back uniformly bland. Brenner was quiet, polite, methodical, always had a thermos of weak coffee, ate lunch alone most days, and left promptly at 5 unless there was a deadline. It was almost too perfect, too neutral, the kind of camouflage that made veteran FBI case officer Marcus Hill raise his eyebrows and mutter, "I hate it when they look like nobody," because that usually meant somebody had trained them to look that way. Even more interesting was the nature of Brenner's current assignment. He was reviewing export logs and enrichment conversion factors for uranium shipments temporarily stored at a Nevada-based fuel cycle facility, critical to tracking nuclear proliferation risks and highly sought after by both Soviet intelligence and non-aligned buyers on the black market. It wasn't the kind of data that would make headlines, but it was exactly the kind of technical minutiae that let foreign powers understand U.S. material flow models, supply vulnerabilities, and reprocessing timelines, which meant if Brenner's work was being surveilled, it wasn't random, it was strategic. Hill authorized a full behavioral pattern analysis to be conducted using Brenner's work calendar, badge-in logs, phone records, and movement data from local traffic cams, feeding everything into an internal analytics tool that cross-checked for anomalies against known espionage behavioral flags, deviations in routine, unscheduled nighttime outings, unexplained meetings, unregistered electronics, and even changes in grocery shopping behavior. The analysis would take 72 hours, but until then, Brenner wasn't a suspect. He was a question that needed answering fast, before whoever was on the other end of that listening post realized they'd been seen and disappeared. It began as a blur in the periphery of a surveillance monitor, just a tall man in a brown overcoat pacing the sidewalk on Elmridge Lane, never loitering long enough to arouse suspicion, never standing still, just walking, sometimes with a paper folded under one arm, sometimes with hands in his pockets, sometimes holding a disposable coffee cup that he never seemed to drink from. He didn't approach the parked Dodge Diplomat, didn't touch the vehicle, didn't even glance at it in any obvious way. But every day between 3:40 and 4 p.m., like clockwork, he would appear, walk 2 full loops around the block, and disappear down a side street near the community park where surveillance vans couldn't follow without breaking cover. Initially, the agents monitoring the operation thought he might be a cautious local or an oblivious jogger, but after 3 days of pattern repetition, one of the younger tech agents, a former military SIGINT analyst named Dawson, floated a possibility that sent a chill through the van. "He's a cutout," Dawson said, staring at the time-stamped footage. a non-contact intermediary running sight checks before a pass, possibly activating or confirming a signal path. And suddenly, the man's rigid pacing, his consistent timing, and his careful avoidance of direct contact with the vehicle took on a much darker shade. Special Agent Marcus Hill ordered that the man's face be enhanced and run through multiple databases: criminal, diplomatic, immigration, DC security checkpoint cameras, but nothing came back. No hits, no name, not even a weak match, which meant either the man was operating under a fully scrubbed identity or he was someone with diplomatic shielding, the kind that allowed movement through federal zones without triggering facial match alerts. Surveillance protocol changed immediately. 2 plainclothes agents were tasked with shadowing him discreetly the next time he appeared, while others began cross-referencing local bus and metro lines to determine potential ingress and egress routes. And one senior analyst with CIA liaison clearance quietly checked for overlapping SIGINT pings in the area during the time of the man's walks, hoping to detect if he was triggering a passive beacon or receiving a dead drop signal himself. By the 5th day, the man's behavior escalated slightly. After circling the block twice, he paused at a newspaper box on the far corner of Pinehaven Street, reached in, took out a copy of the Bethesda Chronicle, flipped briefly through it, then left it behind without taking it with him. A gesture subtle enough to mean nothing, unless you knew how Soviet-era brush passes often involved prearranged signals placed in local publications. The paper was collected, scanned, and combed for anomalies. An underlined word, a folded corner, a tear, anything, but nothing surfaced. Even so, Hill was convinced this was a live operational environment, and that meant one thing. The listening car wasn't just an archive node, it was part of a larger system. A system with active human nodes, signal routines, and possibly more than one objective. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just walking, he was watching, confirming, and possibly signaling that the drop site was still safe. Thomas Brenner left his modest split-level home on Elmridge Lane in his usual punctual fashion, wearing a gray overcoat and carrying a black leather briefcase in his right hand. Something entirely unremarkable to the casual observer, yet under the tightening focus of FBI surveillance teams, it was an object of acute interest. Agents had been tracking his every movement for the past 5 days, documenting not only his commute and office interactions, but his small personal rituals, how he watered his front hedges at 6:55 a.m., how he always checked the mail even when none was expected, how he waved at his elderly neighbor Mrs. Keene, but never spoke more than a few words. And it was during this Thursday routine that a quiet pattern emerged, a detail that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. Every Thursday evening, after returning from work, Brenner would emerge again around 9:20 p.m., still in his slacks and shirt sleeves, the briefcase now back in hand, and walk to his personal vehicle, a dented navy blue Pontiac parked just across the driveway from the stolen Dodge Diplomat, and open the trunk. Not in a rushed or secretive way, but with the casual indifference of a man setting something aside for tomorrow, except that the following morning, the briefcase would be gone. Agents on the Thursday night shift confirmed it on 2 back-to-back weeks, and Hill, now leading the joint FBI-CIA task force assigned to the case, flagged it immediately as indicative of a possible drop sequence. Briefcase and trunk overnight, retrieved remotely or by a contact in the early hours before daylight, likely using duplicate keys or a secondary entry method. Field agents were stunned by the audacity of the move. It meant whoever was orchestrating this operation had either breached Brenner's car in advance to plant something, a tracking device, maybe even a receiver, or that Brenner was knowingly leaving the briefcase for someone else to retrieve. Either way, it was a protocol straight out of Cold War espionage doctrine. Dead drop in plain sight, high-traffic suburb, use of target's own vehicle to reduce suspicion, and the Thursdays weren't random either. A deep review of Brenner's schedule revealed that Thursdays were the only days he had end-of-week data briefings at the DOE, which meant the case files, memos, and export figures he handled those days were more comprehensive, more sensitive, and, if copied, more valuable. Surveillance teams began to run infrared scans of the car trunk on Thursday nights, and on the 3rd week, they detected a thermal anomaly between 3:00 and 3:10 a.m., a brief flicker of heat consistent with a human hand, a fast retrieval, no alarm triggered, and no sign of forced entry. It was clean, almost too clean, and when the trunk was inspected the next day, There were no prints, no scratches, no smudges, just an empty space where the briefcase had been, and the lingering certainty that someone, somewhere, now had everything that had been inside it. Under the gray veil of a damp Friday morning, Operation Domino was officially activated, transforming the sleepy Bethesda neighborhood into a live federal surveillance site cloaked beneath layers of suburban normalcy. The FBI, now operating through a joint interagency task force, moved quickly and quietly, outfitting Thomas Brenner's Pontiac with a series of micro-motion detectors wired into the vehicle's trunk hinges, calibrated to detect even the slightest touch, and a redundant set of low-visibility infrared sensors rigged to catch thermal signatures from as far as 20 feet away, all designed to catch a ghost in the act without the ghost ever knowing it was being watched. Plainclothes agents took over 4 houses on the block, 2 of which belonged to families conveniently on vacation, giving the task force full visual coverage of Brenner's driveway and the nearby Dodge Diplomat from multiple angles. Up in the attic of a house across the street, technicians drilled tiny pinhole cameras through the window frames, using fiber optic snakes to capture 24-hour footage of the street from 3 different perspectives. While in the basement of the same house, the nerve center of the operation hummed with surveillance monitors, radio receivers, encrypted field comms, and caffeine-fueled agents logging every flicker of movement like courtroom stenographers on speed. The plan was simple in its design, but complex in execution. Allow Brenner to follow his usual Thursday routine, deposit the briefcase in the trunk just as he had before, then wait, observe, document, and arrest whoever retrieved it, assuming the retrieval actually happened again. Under no circumstances was anyone to intervene prematurely, not unless the briefcase was removed, and the suspect could be followed without compromising the broader operation. And to that end, the agents on duty had been issued strict non-engagement protocols unless ordered directly by Special Agent Marcus Hill or his deputy, Julia West, both of whom remained on site for the full 72-hour window of the sting's opening phase. Even the local utility poles weren't safe. Agents had outfitted them with directional microphones tuned to pick up soft footfalls and whisper-level audio signatures, just in case the retrieval involved quiet communication or verbal confirmation signals. Motion-activated trail cameras were hidden in hedges and trees up and down the block, and drones, painted dull gray and flying no higher than rooftop level, were deployed intermittently in overlapping shifts to eliminate any gaps in coverage during the nighttime hours. Every element had been considered, every failure point gamed out. If the pickup agent was using a cloned key, they'd see it. If he used a relay device to pop the trunk electronically, they'd trace it. If the briefcase simply vanished again with no detectable contact, then they'd know they were up against a level of operational tradecraft that hadn't been seen on U.S. soil since the Berlin Wall was standing tall and the Soviets were paying in diamonds and silence. Now, all that was left was to wait. And in the silence of those pre-dawn hours, with every motion sensor primed and every camera live, the question loomed unspoken in the minds of everyone watching. Would the ghost return? It happened just after 3:12 a.m. On the 3rd Friday of surveillance, silent, precise, almost clinical in execution, and yet exactly the moment Operation Domino had been waiting for. The motion sensors mounted under the trunk of Thomas Brenner's Pontiac flared to life in the monitoring van, triggering a low, vibrating chime that instantly froze every agent in the surveillance center. Within 3 seconds, cameras were spinning, infrared overlays were active, and eyes locked on a single man walking up the driveway wearing dark slacks, scuffed black shoes, and a janitor's uniform with no visible name patch. Just Capital Cleaners stitched onto the chest, a company that, when later investigated, would turn out not to exist. The man moved with calm efficiency, glancing once over his shoulder, then producing what looked like a standard key fob, tapping the car's rear and watching the trunk pop open. No alarm, no hesitation, just the kind of confidence that comes from having done something many times before. Within 10 seconds, he reached in, lifted the briefcase, Brenner's usual black leather carrier, and began walking calmly down the street, not toward any waiting car, but on foot, as if taking a stroll at an impossible hour. Special Agent Marcus Hill didn't wait for confirmation. He snapped into motion, issuing the command, "Engage, but clean. No noise, no civilian contact. Bring him in intact." and immediately 3 field agents peeled off from their parked positions, coordinating silently through radios, tails converging as the man turned onto a darker street just past the neighborhood park. Whether he sensed the trap or just had protocol drilled into him, the suspect suddenly broke into a run, hurling the briefcase into a bush and sprinting down an alley at full speed, forcing agents to break silence and pursue on foot through narrow paths and between backyard fences. It took 3 blocks, 1 near-miss tackle, and a final full-body dive from Agent Larson to bring him down, and even then the man fought like a trained operative. No words, no grunts, no resistance tactics meant to buy time, just an attempt to flee at all costs. Cuffed and breathless, he refused to speak, even as agents rifled through his potage shirts and found a Maryland state ID with the name William Dorsey, later determined to be a forgery, so clean it bypassed 3 DMV checks before failing under UV scan. Prints were run instantly through the FBI and Interpol databases, and within 30 minutes came the result that turned the operation from a domestic surveillance case into a full-blown international intelligence emergency. The man was identified as Erich Voss, a known East German intelligence asset previously flagged in 1986 for suspected support work in Cuba, thought to be inactive for years. He had no known entries into the U.S., no flagged passport activity, and no prior connection to Brenner, until now. Hill stared at the printout in silence for a moment, then muttered, "So the GDR is not dead after all," and gave the order. Full lockdown, no leaks, and immediate debrief with Langley, because whatever this was, it was just beginning. The interrogation room was cold, deliberately so, with a slight hum from the overhead fluorescents designed to unnerve, exactly the kind of environment that wears down even seasoned operatives. And Erich Voss, the captured East German agent, sat in the center of it with the same implacable calm he'd shown since his arrest, saying nothing for the first 6 hours, despite the mounting evidence against him. But Special Agent Marcus Hill had played this game before and knew the silence wouldn't last. Not when they started laying out the photographs from the sting, the time-stamped surveillance stills, the fake ID, the heat-mapped retrieval data, and most importantly, the revelation that his prints had matched with a flagged Stasi operative believed to have disappeared in Hungary in 1989. When Hill slid across the photo of the Dodge Diplomat, carefully labeled with notations on the signal hardware discovered inside, Voss finally blinked, just once, but it was enough. Over the next 4 hours, his words came in clipped, deliberate fragments, fed slowly as if still weighing how much damage his confession could do. But what he revealed was staggering. The car had been planted 6 weeks prior by a 3-man team operating out of a rented warehouse in Laurel, Maryland, its sole purpose to act as a passive listening post aimed directly at Brenner's home, not the workplace, not the DOE, but the house, because Moscow Center had been fed a rumor through one of their deep-cover moles that Thomas Brenner wasn't just a mid-level analyst anymore, but a suspected CIA double agent planted inside the Department of Energy's nuclear oversight arm. Someone, somewhere, had suggested Brenner had begun passing doctored data to U.S. allies to confuse international arms inspections and sabotage non-proliferation talks. And the KGB wanted confirmation, but they couldn't risk exposing their own mole by asking outright, so they turned to external passive surveillance to determine if Brenner had been flipped. The listening post wasn't meant to steal secrets. It was meant to listen for personal conversations, arguments, phone calls, or any indication that Brenner was receiving unusual instructions or speaking in coded terms that might signal CIA direction. Voss admitted he was the retrieval agent for the briefcase operation, but insisted he had no direct contact with Brenner, and more importantly, believed Brenner was not aware he was under surveillance or that his case files were being duplicated. According to his protocol, the briefcase was removed, scanned, and returned when possible, or discarded if pickup conditions were compromised, all handled without Brenner's knowledge. When asked who had given the order to activate a dormant East German asset like him, Voss refused to answer, stating only that some networks don't die when countries do, and that his loyalty wasn't to a flag anymore, but to an old debt that hadn't been paid. Hill leaned back, stunned, not because of the scope of the surveillance, but because the Soviets weren't trying to recruit Brenner. They were afraid they'd already lost him, and in the Cold War's deep shadows, suspicion was enough to justify anything. What the arrest of Erich Voss revealed over the following 6 weeks would ripple far beyond Bethesda and the Department of Energy. It cracked open a Cold War relic that no one realized had been quietly breathing beneath the surface of suburban America. The briefcase sting, successful as it was, turned out to be just one thread in a deeply embedded Soviet counterintelligence network that had never fully disbanded after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when analysts traced Voss's movements, cross-referenced rental records, utility payments, and intercepted communications, they uncovered 3 additional surveillance operations in progress, 2 in Virginia and 1 outside Chicago, all centered on U.S. government employees suspected, falsely, of being compromised double agents. Thomas Brenner, for his part, was cleared almost immediately after Voss's interrogation, with weeks of wiretap transcripts, surveillance footage, and forensic analysis confirming he had no knowledge of the briefcase handoffs or the listening post across from his home. In truth, Brenner had simply been a convenient suspect, chosen not because of what he'd done, but because someone within the Soviet remnants thought he might be flipped. One misinterpreted personnel transfer in a CIA-adjacent office, one unexplained gap in his security clearance renewal file, one coffee meeting with a colleague who happened to be under internal review, and that was enough. In a world of intelligence shadows, even imagined betrayals could launch operations, and this one had nearly spiraled into disaster. Yet, what made the case extraordinary was not the sophistication of the surveillance equipment, nor the quiet efficiency of the FBI's sting, but the fact that it had all started with a parked car that stayed in the same spot too long. A neighbor's simple phone call about an out-of-place vehicle had escalated into a full-blown international manhunt, exposed sleeper protocols from the defunct East German Stasi, triggered counter-espionage briefings across 4 federal agencies, and forced a re-evaluation of what foreign intelligence networks might still be active in post-Cold War America. For all the encryption, satellite tracking, and cyber infiltration dominating modern headlines, this was a case solved by patience, observation, and an acute awareness that nothing in espionage ever really ends. It just changes form. And while the Diplomat was eventually towed and stored in a classified evidence warehouse, and Voss sentenced to federal prison under a sealed plea deal with no media coverage, the story lived on inside the FBI's internal training curriculum as a cautionary tale, how one static object, a car, became the keyhole into a ghost network of intelligence veterans who had never put their tools away. Years later, when new analysts studied the files under clearance, they wouldn't remember Thomas Brenner's name or the layout of Elmridge Lane, but they would remember the operation's unofficial motto, scribbled in the corner of Marcus Hill's notes on page 1, "Watch what doesn't move." It's usually the thing listening.